when emotion is no longer required. There is a kind of discipline that makes people uneasy. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. You wake before the alarm, lungs pulling in cold air, fingers stiff as they find the floor. No surge of feeling. No inner speech. The body moves, and the day begins. Others ask how you feel. You do not answer. You are already tying the belt. Most people believe discipline depends on emotion. Drive. Passion. A spark that ignites action. Watch them start strong, faces flushed, voices loud. Weeks pass. The heat fades. Shoes stay by the door. The room grows quiet. They tell themselves they lost motivation, as if it were stolen. The truth sits heavier than that. You have felt this loop. Standing in a dim room at dawn, shoulders tight, mouth dry, weighing the cost of beginning. The negotiation starts. Just today. Just this once. Outside, the world waits. Inside, the argument grows louder than the act itself. By the time a decision is made, the moment is gone. Someone else is already moving. Ancient warriors and monks understood something colder. They did not wait for emotion to arrive. They trained when the air burned the lungs and when the body ached from repetition. Knees folded to the mat without ceremony. Breath counted itself when the mind resisted. Others watched, unsure why this constancy felt unsettling. No explanation was offered. If you are tired of bargaining with yourself, name the habit you abandoned last year. Write it down before continuing. If nothing comes to mind, that absence is already speaking, the person who looked just like you. Let me tell you about someone familiar. He sets the shoes by the door at night. Laces straight. Socks folded. The room is dim, air cool against the skin. In the morning, he stands there anyway, jaw tight, pulse loud in the ears. He knows what to do. Knowing has never been the problem. He begins with intensity. The first days are clean. Breath sharp in the chest, sweat warming the back, muscles answering quickly. People notice. They nod. They comment. Their approval lands lightly, then disappears. A week later, the body feels heavier. Eyelids drag. The floor feels colder. He checks the weather. He checks the clock. The shoes stay where they are. Someone texts. He answers. The moment passes. At work, he talks about plans. At dinner, he explains the interruption. Friends laugh and say balance matters. He laughs with them. Inside, something tightens. Not guilt. Recognition. He has been here before. Hands gripping the table, shoulders stiff, he feels the familiar dull ache of a promise thinning out. No one confronts him. That silence is worse. He does not lack intelligence. He does not lack desire. He lacks continuity. Each morning, the same quiet conflict returns. The body leans forward. The mind pulls back. Cold air fills the lungs while arguments stack up. Just today. Just until things settle. The body waits for permission that never arrives. In places older than these conversations, permission was never part of the ritual. A monk wakes before the bell, not from resolve, but because the mat feels wrong beneath a sleeping body. Knees fold to the floor. The mat is rough. Breath fogs the air. Others in the hall do the same. No one asks how it feels. Feeling is irrelevant. The room holds the rule. When this man visits a gym again weeks later, the faces have changed. The ones who stayed do not greet him loudly. They are already moving. Their repetition is quiet. It creates distance. He feels it in the chest, a small pressure of exclusion. Not unkind. Unyielding. He warms up alone, skin cooling between sets, realizing the cost was never effort. It was choice. He leaves with sweat drying on his neck and an unanswered question following him out the door. If emotion keeps failing him, what remains when it is removed? where identity replaces the morning debate. In the temple, no one asks if today is a good day to practice. Dawn arrives. The bell sounds. The body rises. Cold stone presses into bare feet. Fingers ache as they adjust the robe. Breath is shallow at first, then steadies. The hall fills with movement that looks identical from the outside. Inside, each body carries its own resistance. No one negotiates it aloud. A monk sits even when fever lingers. Sweat cools on the spine. Legs throb. The posture shortens, but it does not disappear. Others notice the slight tremor, the restrained effort. No praise follows. The rule holds. Continuity matters more than display. The body learns this quietly. Contrast that with the modern morning. An alarm buzzes. A hand reaches out, heavy with sleep. The phone lights the room. Messages wait. Weather reports scroll. The mind wakes before the body and starts speaking. Outside, the air is sharp. Inside, excuses stack neatly. The belt remains untied. Someone else posts about their workout. The comparison stings. The day begins already fragmented. Identity works differently. A swordsman wraps his hands around the handle the same way every time. Calluses catch on the grip. The wood is familiar. He does not ask if he wants to train. Wanting is not part of the process. Others in the yard feel the rhythm of his strikes before they see him. Repetition creates expectation. Breaking it would feel like injury. When discipline is tied to emotion, every session is a gamble. When it is tied to identity, absence feels wrong. A runner who misses his usual hour feels restless at dinner. Legs twitch under the table. Appetite dulls. Friends joke about obsession. Their tone carries unease. Predictability unsettles people who still decide daily who they are. Removing choice is not dramatic. Shoes are laid out the night before. The mat is unrolled. The schedule is fixed. Morning arrives and the body moves before consent. Cold air fills the lungs. Shoulders loosen. The mind arrives late and finds the work already underway. There is relief in that lateness. This shift creates friction. Invitations decline. Explanations shorten. Can't I train then? Some laugh. Some stop asking. Silence grows around the edges of your routine. In that silence, the habit hardens. It no longer belongs to mood or weather. It belongs to you. One evening, the man from before stands again by the door. Shoes ready. No surge of feeling comes. The room is quiet. He goes anyway. Outside, the street is empty. Inside his chest, something steadies. Not pride. Alignment. The debate did not vanish. It was simply ignored. He returns later, sweat cooling, pulse calm, aware that something subtle has shifted. If this continues, who will he be when choice is no longer available? The quiet war no one sees. Most mornings are not lost to failure. They are lost to conversation. You stand in the kitchen, floor cold under bare feet, kettle humming. Shoulders tight. Mouth dry. The body leans toward the door. The mind pulls back. Just today. Just until things calm down. The words feel reasonable. That is why they work. The negotiation always sounds the same. Fatigue presents its case. Schedule offers compromise. Comfort frames itself as wisdom. You listen while your hands rest on the counter, fingers numb, pulse ticking louder than the room. Outside, someone passes by already moving. You hear their steps fade. The argument inside grows softer once the chance is gone. In training halls, this war is understood. That is why it is never allowed to begin. When rain falls, practice moves indoors without discussion. When injury appears, intensity drops but presence remains. A swordsman practices footwork slowly, sweat cooling on his neck, jaw set. Others see the reduced pace. They do not comment. The rule holds: when X happens, Y follows. No space for debate. A runner finishes late one evening, legs heavy, breath rasping. Tomorrow's forecast promises heat. Shoes are placed by the door anyway. The decision is already made. Morning arrives. The air is thick. Skin slicks with sweat early. Pace shortens. He runs. Neighbors watch from windows, puzzled by the lack of drama. There is no heroism here. Only sequence. Compare this to the office worker who waits for clarity. He sits at the edge of the bed, phone glowing, eyes burning from sleep. Messages stack up. The body asks for movement. The mind asks for certainty. None arrives. He stays seated. Later, he explains the delay to no one in particular. His shoulders carry the weight of an argument that never needed to happen. Pre-decided responses remove this burden. When schedule breaks, the next available slot is used immediately. Not tomorrow. Not next week. The chain matters. A monk with fever still sits briefly. Sweat beads on the brow. Breath is shallow. The sitting ends early, but it happens. Others notice the brevity and the return the next day. Continuity is preserved. Respect grows in silence. These rules create social friction. Friends suggest flexibility. Colleagues raise eyebrows when you decline. Just this once, they say. You shake your head, muscles warm from earlier work, skin still reacting to cold air. No explanation follows. The refusal feels heavy in the room. That weight is the cost of removing choice. Over time, the internal war weakens. Not because you won, but because it starved. The mind arrives late to find the body already engaged. Breath counts return on their own. Hands move without ceremony. The argument has nowhere to land. One morning, you notice the silence inside and feel a flicker of unease. If negotiation is gone, what else will be taken with it, when consistency refuses to break cleanly? Injury changes the sound of training. Footsteps shorten. Breath tightens sooner. The floor feels harder under the knees. A warrior with a strained leg does not vanish. He arrives earlier, wraps the joint, tests weight slowly. The movement is smaller. The presence remains. Others notice the restraint. No one praises it. The rule is older than approval. Most people disappear when perfection leaves. A missed week becomes a missed month. A single lapse grows into a story. You see it in the way they speak later, eyes shifting, hands restless. They talk about starting fresh. The chain is already broken. Starting over feels easier than facing the gap. Continuity does not ask for intensity. It asks for return. A monk sits for 3 minutes instead of an hour. Sweat cools on the back. Legs burn. The bell rings. He stands, bows, leaves. The next morning, he returns. Others in the hall register the pattern. It settles the room. The body remembers what the mind wants to forget. The modern equivalent is quieter. A writer opens the document on a bad day. Fingers stiff. Eyes dry. One sentence appears. It is not good. It exists. The file closes. Dinner tastes dull. Friends ask how the work is going. It continues, he says. The conversation moves on. Something solid remains. This refusal to break cleanly irritates people. They prefer clear endings. Quit or commit. The middle unsettles them. When you show up injured, tired, distracted, you disrupt their narrative. They watch you stretch slowly, skin reacting to cold air, and feel exposed. If you can continue imperfectly, what excuse remains for stopping entirely? There is no drama in this. Just repetition without applause. Shoes go on. Mat unrolls. The belt is tied before the mind starts bargaining. Some days the session is brief. Some days it is heavy. All days are counted. The count itself becomes the anchor. Over time, the body learns safety in this return. Anxiety fades sooner. Sleep deepens. Pulse steadies faster under strain. None of this is announced. Others sense it in posture, in the way you leave gatherings early without apology. Invitations thin out. The silence grows cleaner. The man who once waited for emotion now measures days differently. He no longer asks if a session was good. He asks if it existed. On evenings when exhaustion presses behind the eyes, he still lays out his clothes. The act is small. The effect accumulates. One night, he realizes he no longer remembers the last time he quit entirely. The thought is distant, almost foreign. In its place sits a quieter concern. If continuity can survive this much imperfection, what part of him is still trying to escape? When obstacles are answered before they appear. Rain changes the texture of the morning. The air turns heavier. Pavement darkens. A runner steps outside anyway, shoes already on, laces tight against stiff fingers. The route shifts without thought. Under an overpass. Into a stairwell. Movement continues. Neighbors watch from behind glass, coffee steaming in their hands, unsure why the weather did not win today. Most people fail here, not from weakness, but from delay. An obstacle appears and the mind wakes fully. It starts sorting options. Cancel. Postpone. Replace. By the time a choice is made, the body has cooled. Shoulders slump. The moment closes itself. Later, they describe the obstacle as if it were fate. In disciplined systems, obstacles are anticipated, not debated. When exhaustion appears, intensity drops. When schedule breaks, the next available slot is used immediately. No analysis follows. A swordsman with a long day behind him shortens practice to a single form. Sweat barely beads. Muscles stay warm. Others see the brief session and nod. The chain holds. This creates an odd calm. Anxiety loses its leverage when it has no surprises left. The body knows what happens next. Cold air hits the lungs. Breath adjusts. Pulse steadies. The mind arrives late again, stripped of urgency. It looks for drama and finds routine instead. Social friction sharpens at this stage. Friends propose spontaneity. Just skip tonight, they say, smiling. You stand there, jacket half on, skin cooling, feeling the pull of comfort. You decline. Not harshly. Simply. The room shifts. Someone rolls their eyes. Another shrugs. You leave. The door closes on a silence thicker than before. Over time, people stop testing these edges. They learn your responses. Predictability settles around you like armor. It limits options, and that limitation feels threatening to those who still choose daily who they will be. They joke about rigidity. You notice the distance growing. You also notice how light the mornings feel without explanation. The man who once stalled at every disruption now moves through them cleanly. Traffic slows him, he adjusts the session length. Meetings run late, he trains at night. Fatigue presses, he reduces volume. The rule is never broken. Only adapted. Each adaptation reinforces the same identity. One evening, he realizes the day threw nothing unexpected at him anymore. Not because life softened, but because responses were already in place. The absence of surprise brings a new unease. If obstacles no longer decide his actions, what will test him next? The moment the body moves first. At some point, the order reverses. You notice it on an unremarkable morning. The alarm sounds. Eyes open. Before any sentence forms, your feet touch the floor. Cold seeps upward. Calves tighten. Breath pulls itself in. The mind arrives seconds later, confused to find the body already halfway through the ritual. This is not ease. The weight is still there. Shoulders ache. Fingers are stiff as they tie laces. But the argument never surfaces. It has learned it is no longer consulted. The body has rehearsed this sequence too many times to wait. Others notice before you do. At work, you sit straighter during long meetings, legs still charged with movement. Someone comments that you seem different. Not energized. Just settled. When schedules shift, you adjust without complaint. The absence of drama makes people uneasy. They prefer visible struggle. It reassures them. Training sessions lose their emotional spikes. There is no high. No crash. Just repetition. Sweat forms. Sweat dries. Pulse steadies. A man beside you skips a day, then another. He jokes about needing rest. You nod. You were here yesterday. You will be here tomorrow. The contrast sharpens without words. Friends begin to treat your routine as immovable. Invitations come with disclaimers. After your training, they say. Some stop inviting altogether. The social circle thins. In its place grows a quieter space. Mornings feel wider. Evenings feel clean. You no longer rush to explain yourself. This transformation carries a cost. Identity hardens. Flexibility narrows. You feel it when a rare exception is required. The body resists deviation. Pulse lifts. Jaw tightens. You follow through anyway, then return immediately to the pattern. The interruption leaves a faint irritation, like grit under the skin. That irritation guides you back. In the training hall, elders watch this stage carefully. It is where arrogance can slip in. The body obeys so readily that attention dulls. A mistake lands harder. A grip loosens. Correction follows without ceremony. Embarrassment warms the face. The lesson is clear: automation does not replace presence. The man who once needed emotion now trusts something colder. Sequence. Timing. Return. He feels the loss of negotiation as both relief and constraint. Life feels narrower, sharper. There is less to decide, and more to live with. One night, lying awake with muscles heavy and breath slow, he wonders if this path is closing doors he has not yet seen. If discipline now moves him without consent, what will happen when it demands more than he planned to give, when your presence becomes uncomfortable to others? The change does not announce itself. It leaks out through routine. You arrive early, not eager, not tense. Just there. The room is still half asleep. Lights hum. Air sits cool on the skin. You begin without warming up conversation. Others drift in later, louder, scanning faces for energy. They register yours and look away. Predictability unsettles people. They cannot read it. When your actions no longer respond to mood, comparison becomes unavoidable. A colleague jokes that you are too rigid. The laughter lands shallow. You feel it in the chest, a brief tightening, then release. You return to the task. The joke hangs without a home. Friends test you less now. They know the answers. I train then. No apology. No story. Invitations adjust or disappear. Social life reorganizes itself around your absence. At dinners you do attend, you leave early. Muscles still warm under the jacket. Someone asks if you are obsessed. You shrug. The word means nothing anymore. This stage exposes a quiet truth. Discipline that does not need emotion no longer needs validation. You stop looking for permission in other people's reactions. Approval fades. Disapproval loses weight. The body continues. The floor is cold, you kneel anyway. Breath steadies. Hands repeat familiar work. The room accepts it, eventually. There is a cost. You feel it when you notice how narrow your days have become. Less variety. Fewer impulses indulged. The reward is not pleasure. It is alignment. When you miss a session now, the absence feels physical. Appetite dulls. Sleep turns shallow. The body knows something is out of place. You correct it without drama. Others watch this correction with discomfort. They prefer stories of burnout or rebellion. Your quiet return offers neither. It suggests another possibility they are not ready to face. That suggestion creates distance. You accept it. Distance is lighter than compromise. In older traditions, this was understood as a threshold. Past it, discipline stops being a tool and becomes a mirror. It shows you exactly who you are, stripped of mood and excuse. That clarity is sharp. Not everyone wants it. Late one evening, you clean your gear in silence. Movements are slow, deliberate. Skin reacts to cool water. The day replays without commentary. No highs, no lows. Just sequence. You realize emotion did not drive any of it. Nor did force. Something else held the line. As you prepare for sleep, the thought settles with unexpected weight. If discipline no longer needs emotion, it also no longer needs justification. The question that remains is simple, and heavy. When nothing is left to hide behind, who are you now? What remains when feeling is gone? Discipline is not something you perform each day. It is something that remains when performance collapses. When emotion thins out. When the room is quiet and no one is watching. It shows itself in the way your body rises without instruction, in the way your hands move before the mind forms an opinion. This is not strength. Strength still strains. This is order. An internal arrangement that no longer waits for permission. The unshakable person is not the one who feels ready. It is the one who no longer negotiates readiness at all. Mood passes. Weather shifts. The rule holds. There is a cost to this. Your life narrows. Options reduce. Some doors close quietly. You feel it in the thinning of invitations, in the glances that linger a second too long. People sense the absence of flexibility and call it intensity. They are not wrong. Intensity is simply identity without decoration. Emotion still exists. It just no longer decides. Joy comes and goes. Fatigue presses and recedes. None of it alters the sequence. The body has learned the path. It follows it with or without encouragement. That learning is irreversible. This is why discipline like this feels cold from the outside. It offers no story. No struggle to admire. Only repetition. Only return. Only the quiet accusation it places on those who still need to feel a certain way before they act. If this exposed something in you, do not explain it. Explanation weakens alignment. Comment your public commitment. One sentence. No context. No emotion.